Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 39, Challenging the Mountain. In the Hall of the Gods, the deities stared at the swirling blur that was the mountain. No matter how they tried, it refused to come into focus. With varying degrees of impatience, they turned their attention to the gathering in Endura's chapel and prepared to aid their mortal agents. In the centre of that circle of agents, Brianda Bloodbriar felt them come. She felt it as a distant thing, a comfort as the scry picked up her consciousness and carried it toward the mountain that refused to come clear in her mind's eye. She didn't let it distract her, but kept her attention on the mountain, diving into the swirling haze surrounding it and stretching every sense she had in an attempt to see danger before it reached them. Something resisted their coming, a strange magic that bent like a soap-bubbled surface, but refused to give way. She pushed against it, feeling it give and then sensing it tear like paper carrying too much weight. Brianda, sent, Brianda centered on that weakness and pushed against it as somewhere far away Grumwell squeezed her hand in encouragement, then lent his weight to her efforts. The resistance tore like paper beneath them, and they slid through, drawing incorporeal weapons to go with their very incorporeal forms. The others followed. Once they were inside the protective bubble surrounding the mountain, they dropped, landing in thick, knee-high mountain grass. Their presence became corporeal, as though the act of making it through the bubble had given their mental presence form. Brianda sensed the others around her, but it took a moment of concentration before she could see them. They stood together at the mountain's foot, weapons drawn and ready. On the mountain, they were no longer holding hands. Although far away, she could still feel Grunwald's grip in her own. Mist drifted around them, thickening to fog as the trail wound up the mountain. This is what a projection is like, she thought, gripping her blades and moving cautiously forward. When Raoma moved alongside her, as though he would lead the group up the path, Grunwald laid a hand on his arm. "This is not your place," he said, and hurried on to explain. "There are others more practiced whose skills will keep us more safely than your own." The beast elf looked around, his eyes catching sight of several elves and men who wore the traditional buckskin and mottle of foresters and hunters. They all looked toward him as though awaiting his permission, and he sighed, waving them forward. "Go," he ordered. "This is why you were chosen, since I have little knowledge of trails and the hazards thereof." One of the scouts nodded. Her dark hair was braided into a loop resting at the nape of her neck. Her green eyes sparkled. She was wearing buckskin overlaid by a tunic of mottled green and brown. Her clothing matched that of the man standing beside her, but he was the only human of the three. Both the woman and the other scout were of elven descent. The trio conferred before moving quietly to either side of the trail and working their cautious way up the mountain. Romar looked down at Alessia, who stood by his side. "Well, Mouse," he said, "I think the next part of this journey belongs to you and your colleagues." Alessia shook her head. "Not to me," she replied, gesturing toward a small cluster of mages standing nearby. "To my colleagues, perhaps, but my own magic is too unpredictable." Roma raised an eyebrow at her reply and nodded to the mages. "Please," he told them, motioning toward the mountain. "Do as you must." They gave him a group of startled glances, then the nearest one nodded, and they huddled together, their attention shifting to the mountain and the trail that lay ahead. As they did, other like-talented members of the party drew together, the priests to huddle like the mages and discuss the mountain, and the warriors more briefly. The latter bowed to Endura's expertise, then broke apart, ensuring each group of non-warriors had at least one guardian set toward them. Most had 3 or 4. Rohemar studied the others, but saw none that shared the one talent both he and Brianda held. It worried him, but he saw no need to draw attention to their undeclared skills. He needed to establish a base of trust, and how much trust could there be once he revealed their talents as thieves? He was still pondering what to do next when a scream rent the fog-bound air ahead, and the groups around him ran toward it. "Heroes all," he thought, surprised. "Heroes all," he thought. "Heroes all," he thought, surprised to feel satisfaction instead of scorn. He gave an internal sigh. And now I am to become one of them. That thought should have bothered him, but it didn't. It made him feel pride, shrugging the puzzle aside, along with the curiosity as to why he didn't feel a sense of pity for them. Ryoma, Ryoma raced with them, noting how none of the disparate groups flinched when they merged into one. Around him he felt magic gathering in answer to the Major's united call. It reminded him of Varan, his mind's eye picturing the boy reaching out to touch and pull some of the arcane strands to himself. The memory drew his attention to Alessia. The wizardess was running slightly ahead of him, but running to one side of the others, as though she wanted to be a part of them but dared not get too close. The wild magic shimmering over her skin revealed why, even as she rubbed her upper arms with her hands. It looked like she was trying to ward away the cold. Or like she's afraid, Raomar mused as Brianda reached out to comfort her. Raomar lashed out, seizing the girl's wrist with his hand and jerking it back. Brianda gasped. "Don't touch her," Raomar ordered. He flicked his gaze toward the wizardess. "The magic comes even when she doesn't ask it," he warned. As he spoke, they both looked at Alessia and they both drew back at the sight of the lightning racing up and around the wizardess's body. The other mages had noticed it too and also edged away. Another scream caught their ears, but this time they saw who made it. The first of the foresters, her arm hanging limply by her side, rolled away from the gaping maw of a twisted earth elemental. The creature rose from the ground, its rough hide glistening damply in the mist, its teeth gleaming as it pursued the forester. Alessia's voice rose in a trembling chant, the words shaping the magic wreathing her body, and Roma sensed the power gather. He saw the other mages shift abruptly away from her as it coalesced, and reached out and gripped Brianda's arm, pulling her further back from the mage. Alessia's voice reached a crescendo, lifting above the scouts' cries of pain and anger, the weird's roar and the almost physical rush of gathered magic. The lightnings leapt away from her, and the earth weird bellowed in pain. Its body convulsed, its roar cut short as it blew apart from within. The forester gave an involuntary cry as the human scout grabbed her under the arms and dragged her to her feet. The man glanced around until his gaze fell on Reoma. Then he lifted the injured woman and brought her toward him. "You're a priest," he said tersely, his voice asking for help even though his words did not. Roma didn't reply, but he raised his hands and traced the torn flesh of the forester's dangling arm, and then worked his way down to the gaping rent in her side. She flinched, but he ignored the movement, drawing instead from the well of power Staravan had provided. He felt the god's magic rise at his request and directed its flow into the wound. At first, nothing happened, and he frowned, concentrating harder as the knights intercepted the weird and the sound of battle crescendoed nearby. Feeling the magic pause, Roma gave it a Feeling the magic pause, Roma gave it a gentle nudge, relieved when it flowed into the elf and the flesh around her wound began to knit. As soon as it was mended, he glanced at the scout. "Take her back to the ring," he instructed. "She needs to rest." The she-elf struggled in her companion's arms. "No," she protested, "not yet. I'll stay and see it through. I'm not going until we've seen his prison, until we've seen where—" She let her words trail off, giving Roma and her companion her most pleading look. Roma met her gaze and sighed, glancing at the human scout and the elf's male counterparts as they arrived. The senior of the two shrugged and gestured toward her. "As she wishes," he said. "She knows her limits better than any of us." "And we won't hear the end of it otherwise," her other counterpart put in, ignoring the she-elf's glare. Roma frowned, his attention torn between the she-elf and the battle beyond. One of the knights finished an invading elemental with a well-placed stroke through its head, and it dropped to the ground, unravelling in a foul-smelling pile of dirt. The she-elf twisted out of the human's arms, landing lightly at Riomar's feet. "I am fit enough," she declared, "thanks to you." A second cry of alarm reached them. It was answered by a roar of spiteful fury, followed by a frantic gurgle that ended in a sickening crunch. The ground erupted at their feet, spilling them backward into the valley created by a similar upsurge in the direction of that suddenly ended cry. Brianda dug her hands into the rising earth and locked her toes and knees against the column of another weird's body. It hissed in anger, and she looked toward its head. To her surprise, she saw nothing of the corruption so visible in the weirds that had just attacked them. Gathering himself from the ground, Roma reached for Alessia and drew her close, glad her magics had settled beneath her skin. As he hugged her to his side, he saw that the creature was ignoring Brianda and that its gaze was turned outward. It pivoted on its own axis, searching the area with a sense of anxiety until its eyes fell on Roma. It stopped, taking in the way Roma held the wizardess and sending a gentle breath of warm air over the pair. Ignoring the rogue clinging to its head, it spoke. If your scouts can find the citadel's door, it told them, we will amuse these others while you enter. Once you are inside, we will be unable to aid you, but that which denies us entry denies it also to these. The last word came out as a roar of outrage and pain as it whipped around, dislodging Brianda's grip. Ignoring the rogue on its back, the creature lunged toward another of its twisted cousins. This one had its snout buried in the earthweird's flank. Brianda pushed away from its rocky flesh, twisting in the air in an attempt to guide her landing. She had enough of it under control to roll as soon as she hit the ground. The fighting elementals rolled away from her in a roiling mass of earth and stone. Keeping a wary eye on them, Brianda rolled to her feet and looked for Raomar. He caught her gaze and motioned for her to join him, then continued speaking with one of the foresters. "And you're sure there was nothing there?" he asked. The human scout nodded. Rianne was going in for a closer look when that thing attacked her. Roma held at their gazes and nodded solemnly, then lifted his head to scan the rest of the group. He redirected his gaze to Brianda when she came to stand beside him and gestured toward her. "This is Brianda," he said, lowering his voice. "If you can find the door, she can open it." He glanced around, then continued softly, "I would join you, but my presence will be missed." Again, he looked around those who'd been placed in the center circle, stopping when Sindra stepped forward. Again he gestured to draw the forester's attention to her. "Sindra," he said by way of introduction. "She will try to ensure that no magic can harm you, and—" He looked around before beckoning an elven man dressed in the robes of a priest of Sophriel, and a mage as well. "And this man will try to keep any magic at bay." The elf bowed. "My name is Saren," he said, glancing at Rheoma and failing to keep his distaste for the beast elf from his face. Rather than say anything, he changed the subject. "Have you found the door?" Ignoring his dislike, Rheoma answered, "We think so." He touched Staravan's symbol, fingering it lightly but keeping his eyes on the men before him. "The foresters will guide you, and Brianda will open it for you, but you and Sindra must ensure that nothing prevents them from doing their part." Saren inclined his head. "It shall be so," he said, before turning away. As if he'd given a signal, the foresters turned with him, arraying themselves so they led the way up the faint mountain path toward where a heavy shroud of vines and shrubs blanketed a cliff wall. Roma clenched his jaw, then turned to the others. Saren wouldn't be the only one to hate him for his race, and the only way to change that would be through his service to Staravan. "We must go," he instructed. "We've found a portal." He turned to follow the scouts, but was stopped when another of the wizards spoke. "And what of Nathan?" the man asked. Roma turned. "Nathan?" The wizard stepped to one side, motioning toward the mauled body of a red-haired magician. Roma felt his world compress as the enormity of what had happened struck him. Somehow, something of the corporeal world had succeeded in doing what it should not have been able to do. It had entered the realm of this scry projection. More than that, it had entered and succeeded in crushing the throat and chest of one of those who'd accompanied him. Pale beneath the mottled greens and browns of his skin, he turned to Alessia. "How does this translate in the circles?" he demanded. The wizardess gave him a look of pale-faced puzzlement. I do not know," she admitted. Another of Sophriel's wizard priests interrupted. "I do," he said, continuing when he knew he had their attention. "If you feel back along your link to the circle, you can feel him dragging at our hands." Whoever is standing beside him is holding the full weight of his body. His body? Roma exclaimed. He's dead then? The priest shook his head. Not yet, he replied, adding, We can bring him back if we hurry. That is, if we can catch his soul before anything else does. His words brought to mind the sight of Sofriel's spirit as it fled the coaxing darkness that had been the Old One's presence. Reomar shuddered and crossed quickly to kneel beside the magician's body. What can we do? He asked, running his hands across the bone-pierced wounds and feeling only the hollowness of death. We could try to bring him back, the wizard priest suggested. Not my realm, Reomar replied, and sent a tentative request for aid to Staravan. To his surprise, he felt the undeniable negative of the god's reply and sighed. And not of Staravan's will. The wizard priest gave him a startled glance, then looked around at the gathered paladins and priests. Is there anyone here whose god wishes this one's soul returned to the living realm? He asked. Silence answered, but it was a silence filled with gentle requests, as the other priests asked their deities for a decision. One of the knights stood forward. There is no answer, he said in response to the wizard priest's hopeful look. My lady has not seen fit to answer. His words were echoed by others in the circle, and everyone turned their attention to Roma once more. Unexpected sorrow rose in his chest as he laid a hand on the dead man's ruined shoulder. I can only ask again, he said gently. But should Staravan repeat his denial, I'll have no choice but to comply. He bowed his head, raising it in surprise when he felt others kneel around him. This time he was not alone. The entire company of priests knelt with him and sent heartfelt prayers to their gods. The knights would have knelt as well, but a sudden renewal of roars reminded them of the threat that surrounded them. The forms of warped and ruined elementals surged a little further down the slope, their attention currently occupied by the elementals who'd come to distract them. How long that would last, no one knew. Rather than risk an unguarded attack, the knights faced outwards, weapons at the ready, letting wisdom prevail over instinct. Pushing the wizards behind them, they prepared to defend all at their backs, and it proved to be a defence well timed. No sooner had they pushed the last priest behind them than one of the distant weirds twisted toward them and charged, and not even the rapid intervention of one of the undefiled elementals was enough to stop it. More than one knightly blade gleamed with radiated magic as it was drawn. Others sang or murmured as they were pulled from their scabbards. All of them flickered with a ready glint as they were raised by their master's hands. The untainted elemental wheeled to face a second of its ruined cousins, and this time succeeded in blocking its path. With muffled roars of fury, the pair disappeared beneath the mountainside, until only the ground's heaving gave away the ferocity of their battle. The knights sighted the approach of other weirds and prepared to defend themselves and the lives behind them. As they did, two sets of voices chorused disparate messages. It's open! The way is open! He will not be returned to us. The gods refuse it. Regret and victory mingled as the shout of success drowned out the soft regret and startled sadness of the gods' denial. The shout of triumph turned the knights' attention from the death at their back and almost turned it from the next wave of attacking weirds. But magical blades shouted their disapproval and drew the hands that held them to counterattack. The first weird roared as a blue-flamed blade struck, almost decapitating it in one sure blow. Another shrieked as golden lightning wreathed its body and began to contract. And still another died with barely a whimper as the knight-wielded blade blurred, slicing through it, before it could react. Again the ground rolled beneath their feet, and a true elemental, pure and untainted, erupted between the Old One's servants and the knights who fought them. A second elemental surged clear of the ground to intervene on the other side of the circle, and the Old One's creatures roared in frustration. Go quickly, the first elemental instructed. You must reach the door while they can still hold it. Reomar didn't waste time asking questions. He bolted in the direction in which he'd seen Brianda and the scouts disappear, trusting he would see the door when he reached it. Behind him, he heard one of the wizards raise their voice in question. What of the body? Rama glanced around, but before he could find the words necessary to urge the man away from his dead colleague, the elemental answered. We will take care of it, the creature replied. At least on this plane. The real body waits your hands in the circle in the chapel. Reminded of their projected existence, Rama knew the creature spoke the truth. He could feel the man's weight growing heavier in the real. He stopped running and focused to see if he could tell which part of the circle now needed bolstering. But the elemental interrupted. Hurry, it grunted, pain evident in its gravelly tones. We cannot defend ourselves until you are safe. This way, another of the creatures called from further down the path. The doors are beginning to close. Rama grabbed the hands of the two mages nearest him and started running once more. Grunwald did the same, and Alessia pivoted to follow, wild lightning forming a flickering shield around her. More elementals appeared on either side of the path they needed to take, and it didn't take the beast elf long to find the doors. From behind him came the dissatisfied grumbling and hissing of a dozen magical blades being sheathed before they could strike down another opponent. This was followed by the sound of armor rattling as the knights rolled into as much of a run as their gear would allow. Rama thought they sounded surprisingly nimble for the weight they carried, but he didn't look back. He saw the wide-swung portals ahead and led the charge through. He slowed to a halt once he was through and had reached the center of the large stone-walled courtyard beyond. Seeing no immediate threat, he slowed and came full circle, relieved to hear Grunwald speak the question he was already asking himself. Where's Brianda? Relinquishing his grip on the hands he held, Rama looked around, his brow creasing with puzzlement when he didn't see the young rogue. He soon found Sindra, Saren, and the three foresters clustered around the door leading further into the complex. The foresters looked quickly away, torn between keeping watch on the corridor beyond and on studying the door swung into it. Sindra and Saren didn't seem to notice, heads bent close, as they studied the door they'd just had Brianda open. Neither seemed to notice Raumar's approach, but continued their low-voiced discussion, oblivious. Could get her back further in, Sindra said, but Saren shook his head. We could try, he replied doubtfully, scowling as though trying to figure out a difficult situation. If enough of us joined in the spell, we might be able to... He stopped, catching Raumar's arrival over Sindra's shoulder, and Sindra glanced up to follow his gaze. Her face paled when she saw him, and Raumar's heart faltered. Where is she? He demanded, the question coming out harsher than he'd expected. The scouts shuffled a little further away, and now he couldn't be sure if they were keeping watch on the corridor or planning to flee along it. Where? He barked, and they flinched before stepping away from the door. Drawn by the way they bowed their heads and hunched at his approach, Raumar looked past them, taking in the door's details as he did so. It was made of the same polished grey stone as the rest of the citadel, save that set within its centre was a large smoke-coloured crystal. Frozen within the crystal's centre, her face a picture of shocked disbelief, was Brianda, and Raumar came to a disbelieving halt. He blinked once more, stared at his newest apprentice, and then blinked again. Finally, he turned a disbelieving glare on Saren. What happened? He demanded, glad to feel Grunwald's presence at his back, right up until the big man laid one hand on his shoulder. Gently, my friend. It still sounded like Master to Raumar, but he had more important things to worry about. Saren swallowed hard, but he met the ex-guildmaster's eyes, and his voice was steady when he answered. We damped the magic protecting the locks, the wizard told him, and Sindra nodded her confirmation, not interrupting as he continued. It was no easy task. Immortal magic is too strong for any mortals casting to nullify. He looked at Alessia's apprentice and went on. I had to borrow strength from Sindra, and even then it wasn't enough at the end. Meaning? Raumar demanded in ominous tones. Meaning that Brianda got the door unlocked and open before the magic caught her, the mage answered, finishing in a rush, and that there was nothing we could do to stop it. Maybe if one of her hands hadn't still been touching the doors, one of the scouts intervened. She'd let go, another added, but when the door started to close again, she grabbed the edge and fought it. After the level of protections on the locks, Saren said shamefacedly, we did not expect there to be other countermeasures as well. Thomas was reaching for it when there was a sudden flash of light and she was gone, the female scout added, laying a protective hand on the human scout's arm. Roma waited for Sindra to add more detail, but she remained silent. Seeing her staring at the floor, her brow furrowed in concentration, Roma waved a hand before her face, but she looked right through it. Sindra, he said, laying his hand on her shoulder, and awareness snapped back into her face. I'm sorry? Rama suppressed a sigh. I wanted to know if you had anything to add to Saren's account, he said. The girl frowned, and for a moment Rama thought she was going to ask the maze to repeat what he'd said. Apparently Saren did too, because he drew a breath as though to say it again, stopping only when she held up a hand and showed she'd heard. No, what he said is accurate. The only thing I can add is that I'm sure she still lives within the crystal, but cannot and does not need to move, breathe, or speak. The closest I can surmise is that it is some form of stilling spell. From what he knew of such spells, Rama wanted to argue that Brianda probably did feel the need to move and speak, and was probably greatly frustrated by her inability to do so. Can you loose her? He asked. Saren pointed to the symbols carved into the door above the crystal, and repeated across the upper portion of its topmost facet. I don't think so, he replied. Frowning, Rama stepped closer to read the marks, finding it difficult to banish the look of shock and consternation on Brianda's face from his mind. He did not notice Grunwald slip back to the party of knights, magicians, and priests, who waited a respectful distance away, nor did he hear the quietly negotiated agreement between Magrilor of the Elves, Andrew of the Order of the Phoenix, and Grunwald himself. He only noticed them when Grunwald gently lifted him from in front of the crystal-embedded door and set him beside Saren. Damp the magics, the barbarian ordered, unslinging the axe from his back. The elf lord and the holy knight drew their weapons also, and as the other magicians, knights, and priests stretched their hands toward the crystal, the trio struck its center, timing their blows so their blades landed as one. Gold lightning flashed and blue lace thunder rolled as, with a resounding crack, a line split the crystal's facets from the top to bottom of Brianda's prison. Sindra gave a startled cry of alarm, grabbing Saren and Roma by their sleeves and turning them away from the crystal as it exploded in a shower of glistening shards. The three warriors caught the worst of the explosion and were flung back as Brianda tumbled free of the crystal's confines. Roma watched. Andrew's shield would be no good for battle ever again, and his shield arm would need mending. Magrilor landed on his back, a half-dozen long shards buried in his chest, and Grunwald's axe head had shattered, leaving him holding nothing more than his weapons splintered haft. Saren recovered first, pushing Roma to one side and hurrying to Magrilor. Cleric! He shouted. He dropped his voice to a worried groan that Roma caught as the man knelt beside the stricken elf lord. Sophriel, we can't afford to lose any more. Roma heard pain and realized something of what the man must be feeling. After all, he'd only been put aside for a little while, but those who'd served Sophriel knew their deity wasn't coming back, that she'd been cruelly murdered, her presence torn from the heavens, and her realm now stood empty. What power they currently held, when it was gone, there'd be no more. And what use is a priest without a deity to serve? Rama saw Magrilor's hand move slowly to touch one of the shards protruding from his torso. He didn't try to move the other arm. Couldn't, if the size of the shard impaling his shoulder was anything to go by. The enormity of the elf lord's wounds didn't stop Saren from drawing the remainder of the power his goddess had granted and pouring it into Magrilor. Beside him, an elven priest had reached Andrew's side, emptying power into the knight's shattered shield arm as one of his fellow knights cut the shield straps and unlaced the gauntlet. Another priest dropped to his knees beside Grunwald and gently took the axe haft from the barbarian's nerveless fingers. In his shock at the blade's demise, the Northman had failed to notice the splintering of the bones in the hand and wrist that held it. Now that he had noticed it, the pain was turning his face the colour of whey. Seeing his friends and allies taken care of, Raomar moved to Brianda's side and poured the last of his stored power into the half-elf's still form. He was so focused on directing it to where it could help the most that he didn't look up when another's power joined his own. Nor did he break from his focus as he sent his consciousness deeper into her mind, trying to mend the damage that lay there. Beside him, Alessia knelt beside Sindra, her next words almost breaking Raomar's concentration. "Be still," the wizardess instructed her apprentice. "I will mend the hurts." "But how?" Sindra's question echoed Raomar's own curiosity, and he made a note to ask the wizardess the same question later, when they were safely back in the real.